I still hear the words echoing in my ears. "Fat pig, stay out of it," spoken cold and sharp across the Christmas dinner table, in front of my whole family. I never imagined my own flesh and blood could betray me with such cruelty on the one day meant for love and warmth. Today I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Marjorie, and I'm 73 years old. Every morning I drag myself out of bed in my tiny apartment in Queens, where the scent of roasted chestnuts from the street vendors drifts through my cracked window. The radiator clanks like an old friend trying to comfort me, but most days, it just reminds me how alone I am. My arthritis makes every movement a small battle. But I push through because that's what I've always done. Push through, endure, survive. My days bleed into one another, checking on my son's family, trying to keep peace, brushing off their cold shoulders like lint on an old sweater. That December afternoon, as snowflakes pooled outside my window like tiny prayers falling from heaven, I set the table with my grandmother's china. The plates were chipped but still beautiful, just like the memories they held. I hummed Silent Night under my breath, hoping for smiles, maybe a kind word, perhaps even a moment where I felt like I belonged. Instead, I felt invisible until those words stabbed me. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday. The apartment would fill with the aroma of my famous apple cinnamon stuffing, and my late husband Harold would sneak tastes when he thought I wasn't looking. Those old photo albums still sit on my coffee table, their pages yellowed with time. Sometimes I can still smell his aftershave lingering in the fabric of my worn armchair, the one he bought me for our 25th anniversary. I touched the faded picture of my son David as a child, smiling wide and innocent, his gap-toothed grin reminding me of happier times, before he married her, before everything changed, before I became the enemy in my own family's story. But let me start from the beginning, because understanding how I got to that moment requires knowing the sacrifices I made along the way. I lived a lifetime of giving everything I had to the people I loved most. When David was in college at Northwestern in Chicago studying business administration, I sent him money every month. $500 here, $800 there. It doesn't sound like much now, but back then it meant skipping my heart medication for weeks at a time. My doctor warned me about the dangers, but what mother wouldn't choose her child's future over her own health? I worked double shifts at the hospital where I was a nurse's aide for 37 years. My feet would swell so badly I couldn't wear my regular shoes, but I kept going. David needed textbooks. David needed a laptop. David needed money for his fraternity dues. Every need became my responsibility. Every want became my obligation. When he graduated with honors, I was so proud. I saved up for months to buy him a gold watch, something he could wear to job interviews. Something that would remind him of my love every time he checked the time. He wore it once, then told me it wasn't his style. I found it later, still in its box, buried in his closet during a visit. That should have been my first warning sign. David met Rebecca during his senior year. She was studying marketing, came from a wealthy family in Connecticut. The first time he brought her home to Queens, she looked around my small apartment with barely concealed disgust. She smiled, but her eyes were cold. She complimented my decorations, but I could hear the judgment in her voice. Everything about me seemed to fall short of her standards. "It's so quaint," she said, picking up a porcelain figurine my mother had given me. The way she held it, like it might contaminate her manicured fingers, told me everything I needed to know about what she thought of my life. But David was in love, or what he thought was love. Maybe it was just infatuation with her family's money, their connections, their sprawling house in Westport, where the lawn looked like something from a magazine. When they announced their engagement, I was the last to know. David called me 3 days after he'd already told Rebecca's parents, his voice distant and formal. "We're getting married in June," he said. "Rebecca's family is handling most of the arrangements. Most of the arrangements. Not all. Because somehow, I was still expected to contribute. The mother of the groom's traditional responsibilities, they called it. $5,000 for the rehearsal dinner. Another $3,000 for flowers. Money I didn't have but found anyway, taking out a loan against my modest savings account. I remember standing in Rebecca's mother's pristine kitchen in Connecticut, surrounded by marble countertops and crystal chandeliers, feeling like an imposter. The other women spoke of vacation homes in the Hamptons and charity galas, while I calculated how many overtime shifts I'd need to pay for my son's wedding. "Marjorie makes the most wonderful stuffing," Rebecca announced to the group, but her tone made it sound like a consolation prize. "She'll have to share her recipe with our cook someday." Our cook. As if having someone else prepare your meals was the most natural thing in the world. The wedding was beautiful, I have to admit. Rebecca looked stunning in her custom-designed gown, and David was handsome in his tuxedo. But as I sat in the third row, behind Rebecca's extended family and college friends, I felt like a stranger at my own son's celebration. During the reception, Rebecca's father mentioned in his toast that David was trading up by joining their family. Everyone laughed. I smiled and clapped, but inside, my heart cracked a little more. The early years of their marriage were a constant dance of trying to prove my worth. I babysat their first child, Emma, every weekend so they could have their couple time. I'd arrive at their Brooklyn brownstone, bought with Rebecca's trust fund money naturally, loaded down with toys and snacks and enough patience to handle a colicky infant who seemed to cry every time I held her. "She's just not used to you," Rebecca would say, taking Emma from my arms with practiced efficiency. "Some babies are more selective about who they bond with." Selective. That was Rebecca's polite way of saying Emma didn't like me because I wasn't good enough. Even as a baby, she seemed to sense her mother's disapproval of me, but I persevered. I showed up every weekend, every holiday, every time they needed something. When Emma started walking, I was there to catch her when she fell. When she said her first word, Mama, not Grandma, I celebrated anyway. When she got sick with the flu and Rebecca was too squeamish to deal with the mess, guess who cleaned up vomit and changed bed sheets at 2 in the morning? This became the pattern of our relationship. I gave, they took. I offered, they accepted. I loved, they tolerated. When their second child was born, little Michael, I thought things might change. Maybe this time I could be the grandmother I'd always dreamed of being. I knitted blankets and bought board books and cleared out Harold's old office to create a nursery for when they visited. They never visited. "It's just easier if you come to us," David would say whenever I suggested they stay overnight in Queens. "The kids have their routines, their toys, their friends nearby." So I traveled to them. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering happened in their world, never mine. My apartment became a storage unit for the gifts I'd bought but never had the chance to give, the meals I'd prepared but never shared, the love I had to offer but no one seemed to want. The pattern continued for years. Rebecca's requests became demands. David's conversations became shorter. My grandchildren grew up thinking of me as someone who appeared occasionally with presents, not as family. I started keeping track, though I'm not proud of it. $500 here for Emma's dance lessons, $1,000 there for Michael's summer camp, $2,000 for David's emergency car repair that turned out to be an upgrade to a luxury vehicle, $3,000 when Rebecca decided they needed new living room furniture. Always an emergency, always urgent, always positioned as a favor they were doing by allowing me to help. "We hate to ask," Rebecca would say with her perfectly practiced apologetic smile, "but you know how tight things are with David's promotion still pending." David's promotion that had been pending for 3 years. David's promotion that somehow never materialized, but never stopped them from living as if it had. Their Instagram feed was full of expensive restaurants and weekend getaways, while I ate generic cereal for dinner to afford their latest request. I began to wonder if I was a mother or just an unpaid servant in their lives. A convenient solution to whatever problem arose. A reliable source of funds that never seemed to run dry no matter how often they drained it. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once, like Ernest Hemingway wrote about going bankrupt. It started with small slights that I told myself didn't matter. Forgotten Mother's Days, canceled visits, phone calls that went straight to voicemail and took days to be returned. Then came the larger betrayals. The Christmas when I arrived at their house with carefully wrapped presents for everyone, only to find they'd already exchanged gifts as a family without me. "We wanted to have our own little moment first," Rebecca explained, but she couldn't meet my eyes when she said it. The birthday when Emma turned 10 and I wasn't invited to the party because it's just close friends and school parents. As if 20 years of babysitting and birthday gifts and bedtime stories meant nothing. The conversation I overheard while using their bathroom, Rebecca's voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. She's becoming such a burden. David needs to set some boundaries. We can't keep enabling her neediness. My neediness. As if my desire to be part of my son's life was a character flaw rather than natural maternal love. But the moment that broke me completely happened on a cold Tuesday evening in November. I was battling a nasty respiratory infection, the kind that settles in your chest and makes every breath feel like work. I'd been coughing for days, running a low fever, feeling dizzy every time I stood up too quickly. I called David to let him know I might not be able to babysit that weekend as planned. Not asking for help, not seeking sympathy, just giving them notice so they could make other arrangements. "Mom, we really need you this weekend," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of irritation. "Rebecca has her book club, and I have a client dinner. Can't you just take some medicine or something?" Some medicine or something. As if my illness was an inconvenience he could solve with a trip to the pharmacy. "David, I can barely stand up. I don't think I should be around the children when I'm this sick." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, he sighed heavily, as if my perfectly reasonable concern was an enormous burden. "Fine, Mom. We'll figure something else out. But this is really putting us in a difficult position. Putting them in a difficult position. Not concern for my health. Not an offer to help. Just frustration that their reliable babysitter was temporarily out of commission." That conversation haunted me for weeks. I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being his mother and become just another service provider in their lives. Cheaper than a nanny, more reliable than a babysitter, with the added benefit of never asking for time off or decent treatment. The revelation was devastating and liberating in equal measure. I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. The way Rebecca's voice changed when she talked to me versus when she talked to her own mother. The difference between how David treated me during our phone calls and how he acted when his in-laws were around. The subtle but consistent message that my presence was tolerated but not celebrated, needed but not wanted. During one particularly painful visit, I watched Rebecca show Emma photos on her phone of their recent vacation to Disney World, a trip I'd heard nothing about until that moment, despite having talked to David just days before they left. "It was so magical," Rebecca gushed to Emma. "Just our little family, making special memories together. Our little family." The phrase hit me like a slap. I wasn't part of their little family. I was an outsider, a peripheral figure they called when they needed something but excluded from the moments that mattered. That night, alone in my Queens apartment, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears of someone trying to be strong, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone who'd finally acknowledged how deeply they'd been hurt. I pulled out the photo albums I'd been avoiding, the ones filled with pictures of David as a child, birthday parties where I was the only parent present because Harold was working, school plays where I clapped louder than anyone else in the audience, Little League games where I never missed a single inning, even when it meant giving up overtime pay. I'd been a good mother. I knew I had been. But somehow, that little boy who'd once hugged my legs and told me I was the best mommy in the world had grown up to be a man who saw me as little more than an obligation. The financial abuse was bad enough. The emotional neglect was worse. But what finally pushed me over the edge was discovering just how little I meant to them and how deliberately they'd worked to diminish my role in their lives. It started with a letter that arrived on a cold December morning, just weeks before Christmas. Official-looking envelope, law firm letterhead, my name typed precisely across the front. I almost threw it away, assuming it was some kind of marketing material disguised as legal correspondence. Thank goodness I didn't. Inside was a copy of documents related to the brownstone in Brooklyn, the house where David and Rebecca lived with my grandchildren. The house I'd assumed was just Rebecca's family property, funded by her trust fund and maintained by her parents' generosity. But according to these documents, the house was partially owned by David through a limited liability company, an LLC that had been funded, at least initially, by a loan. A loan that had been co-signed by someone named Marjorie Elizabeth Thompson. That was my name. My full legal name, including the middle name I rarely used except on official documents. My hands started shaking as I read through the paperwork. Dates, dollar amounts, legal terminology I didn't fully understand but recognized as significant. According to these documents, I had guaranteed a $200,000 loan for the purchase of their home. I had never signed such documents. I had never agreed to such an arrangement. I had never even been told about it. But there was my signature at the bottom of the page, or something that looked very much like my signature, on paperwork dated 3 years earlier. Around the same time, David had asked me to co-sign for what he said was a small business loan to help him start a consulting practice. I remember that day clearly. David had seemed nervous, excited about this new opportunity, but worried about qualifying for the loan on his own. Rebecca had been unusually sweet to me, making my favorite tea and asking about my health with what seemed like genuine concern. "It's just a formality, Mom," David had said, spreading papers across their dining room table. "The bank requires a cosigner, but it's really just paperwork. The business will make the payments, and you'll never have to worry about it." I'd signed where they told me to sign, trusting my son completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my child, asking for help with his career. What mother wouldn't want to support her son's ambitions? But now, looking at these documents, I realized I hadn't co-signed for a business loan at all. I'd guaranteed the mortgage on their house, the house they'd lived in for years while telling me how expensive everything was, how tight money was, how much they struggled to make ends meet. The house that was worth well over $1 million in today's market. I spent the rest of that day on the phone with lawyers, trying to understand what these documents meant and what my liability might be. The news was not good. If David and Rebecca defaulted on their mortgage, I could be held responsible for the entire balance. My small savings account, my modest retirement fund, even my apartment could potentially be at risk. But the financial implications weren't what devastated me. It was the realization of how completely I'd been deceived, how carefully they'd manipulated me, how little regard they had for my financial security or my trust. I had been nothing more than a means to an end, a signature on a document that gave them access to wealth I could never dream of possessing myself. That evening, I sat in my small kitchen drinking tea from a chipped mug and staring at those legal documents. The radiator clanked its familiar rhythm, and outside my window the sounds of Queens evening traffic provided a soundtrack to my heartbreak. I thought about all the times they'd asked me for money, all the emergencies and tight months, and, just until David's promotion comes through, requests that I'd honored without question. All the while, they were living in a $1 million house that I was legally responsible for helping them afford. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. But even then, even with clear evidence of their deception, part of me wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. Maybe David didn't realize what he'd asked me to sign. Maybe Rebecca didn't know about the mortgage guarantee. Maybe this was all just a terrible mistake that we could laugh about someday. That hope died 3 days later when I found the voice recording. I'd gone to their house to babysit Michael while they attended what Rebecca called a work function. Emma was at a friend's house, so it was just me and my 5-year-old grandson for the evening. He was such a sweet child, with David's eyes and Harold's gentle disposition. Being with him was one of the few pure joys left in my relationship with their family. We'd spent the evening building elaborate block towers and reading stories about brave knights and clever princesses. Around 8 o'clock, I tucked him into bed and went downstairs to clean up the toys we'd scattered across the living room. That's when I noticed Rebecca's phone on the coffee table, plugged into its charger but apparently forgotten in their rush to leave. The screen lit up when I accidentally bumped it, and I could see several missed calls and text messages. I wasn't trying to spy. I was just going to move the phone so I could dust the table properly. But when I picked it up, the voice memo app was open, and I could see a recording that had been made earlier that day. The timestamp showed it was from that morning, and the duration was almost 10 minutes long. My finger must have brushed the play button accidentally, because suddenly Rebecca's voice filled the room. "I'm so tired of pretending she matters to us. David keeps saying we need to be nice because she's useful, but honestly, how much abuse are we supposed to tolerate for a few $100s here and there? Another voice responded. David's voice, though it sounded different somehow. Harder. Colder than I'd ever heard him speak. It's not just a few $100s anymore, Becca. She co-signed for the house, remember? We need to keep her happy at least until we can refinance or sell. God, I can't wait until we don't need her anymore. Did you see how she looked at me when I mentioned the Disney trip? Like I owed her an explanation for not bringing her along. As if we'd want her there, embarrassing us in front of other families. Rebecca's laugh was sharp and cruel. Nothing like the polite chuckle she used around me. The worst part is how she acts like she's doing us these huge favors. Oh, I don't mind babysitting. Oh, I'm happy to help with the mortgage. It's pathetic, really. She's so desperate for approval that she'll do anything. Well, it's working in our favor, David replied. Mom's been covering about 30% of our monthly expenses for years now, and she thinks she's just helping out occasionally. The house payment, the kids' activities, the car insurance. She doesn't even keep track of how much she gives us. My legs gave out. I sank onto their expensive leather sofa, clutching the phone with trembling hands as my son and daughter-in-law continued their casual destruction of my heart. I just wish she weren't so present all the time, Rebecca continued. Always showing up with advice nobody asked for. Always trying to insert herself into our parenting decisions. The kids are starting to notice how different she is from my parents. Different how? You know, tacky, working class. She still shops at discount stores and clips coupons like we're living in poverty. It's embarrassing when my friends meet her. They can tell immediately that she doesn't belong in our world. Our world. As if becoming middle class had elevated them to some aristocratic status that I, with my working class background and practical values, could never aspire to reach. Maybe we should start setting some boundaries, David suggested. Limit her visits to major holidays only. Make it clear that we don't need her constant involvement in our lives. The problem is the money, though. We still need her financial contribution until your promotion actually comes through, or until we can figure out another way to manage the mortgage. True. I guess we'll have to keep tolerating her for now. But once we're financially stable on our own, we can definitely create some distance. The recording continued for several more minutes, but I couldn't process any more. I fumbled with the phone, trying to stop the playback, my vision blurred by tears I couldn't control. They had been planning to discard me all along, using me financially while counting the days until they could cut me out of their lives completely, treating my love like a strategic resource to be exploited until it was no longer needed. I sat there in their beautiful living room, surrounded by furniture I'd helped them buy, looking at family photos that suddenly felt like lies. In every picture, I was either absent or pushed to the edges, a peripheral figure in the lives of people I'd devoted everything to supporting. The worst part wasn't even the financial manipulation. It was hearing my son, my baby boy, speak about me like I was a burden to be endured rather than a mother to be loved. The casual cruelty in his voice, the complete absence of any affection or gratitude, cut deeper than any amount of monetary deception could have. I deleted the voice memo and put the phone back where I'd found it. Then I went upstairs to check on Michael one more time. He was sleeping peacefully, his little face relaxed and innocent. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe my grandchildren would remember me more kindly than their parents did. Maybe someday, when they were older, they'd understand that their grandmother had loved them completely, even when that love wasn't returned. When David and Rebecca came home that night, I was sitting in the living room reading a magazine as if nothing had happened. I smiled and asked about their evening. I listened to Rebecca complain about the boring speeches at their work function. I accepted David's thanks for watching Michael with the same gracious nod I'd always given. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The voice recording had destroyed any remaining illusions I'd held about our relationship. I finally understood that I wasn't family to them. I was a resource. A convenient source of money and free labor that they intended to discard as soon as they no longer needed me. That night, I rode the subway back to Queens in a daze. The familiar motion of the train, the anonymous faces of other passengers, the dark tunnels rushing past the windows, all of it felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's life, someone else's story. Back in my apartment, I sat at my small kitchen table and did something I should have done years earlier. I started keeping track. Real records this time, not just mental notes. I gathered bank statements and receipts and loan documents. I calculated exactly how much money I'd given them over the years. The total was staggering. Between direct gifts, loan co-signings, and regular financial support, I'd provided them with more than $80,000 over the past decade. $80,000 that I'd earned through years of extra shifts and careful budgeting and sacrifices I'd never mentioned to anyone. $80,000 that they'd accepted as if it were owed to them. I thought about my own financial situation, my modest savings account that had been steadily depleted by their requests, the retirement fund that should have been growing but remained stagnant because I kept withdrawing from it to help them, the medications I'd skipped and the doctor visits I'd postponed to afford their emergencies. All while they lived in a $1 million house and took vacations to Disney World. The anger, when it finally came, was pure and clean and remarkably clarifying. For the first time in years, I wasn't confused about my role in their lives or hurt by their treatment of me. I was simply righteously angry, and I was ready to do something about it. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day with a lawyer Mrs. Torres had recommended. Her daughter was an attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse, and she agreed to meet with me pro bono to review the documents I'd discovered. "This is a clear case of deceptive financial manipulation," she told me after reviewing everything I'd brought. "You have several options, ranging from demanding full disclosure of all financial arrangements to potentially removing yourself from these loan guarantees." She explained that what David and Rebecca had done wasn't just morally wrong. It was potentially illegal. Obtaining my signature through misrepresentation could constitute fraud. Using my financial support under false pretenses might qualify as financial exploitation of an elderly person. But legal options weren't what I wanted. At least not yet. What I wanted was something far more valuable than money or justice. I wanted my dignity back. I wanted to stop being a victim in my own family story. I wanted to reclaim my power. The lawyer helped me understand exactly what documents I'd signed and what my current liabilities were. She also helped me draft a formal letter demanding full financial disclosure from David and Rebecca, including all debts, assets, and ongoing financial arrangements that involved my participation. "You have the right to know exactly what you've committed to," she explained, "and you have the right to remove yourself from any arrangements that were entered into through deception." I spent the next week preparing for the conversation I knew was inevitable. I gathered copies of every document, every bank statement, every piece of evidence that showed the true nature of our financial relationship. I practiced what I would say, how I would present the information, how I would respond to their inevitable attempts to manipulate or intimidate me. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for the possibility that this conversation might end our relationship entirely. As painful as that prospect was, I'd finally reached a point where my self-respect mattered more than their acceptance. The confrontation came sooner than I'd expected. David called me on a Thursday evening, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely contained irritation. "Mom, we need to talk about something. Rebecca thinks you've been acting strange lately. Distant. Is everything okay?" Strange. Distant. As if my newfound reluctance to be taken advantage of was a personality disorder, rather than a long-overdue awakening to reality. "Actually, David, there are some things I'd like to discuss with you and Rebecca as well. Why don't I come over this weekend and we can have a family conversation?" The pause on the other end of the line told me he'd heard something different in my voice, something he wasn't sure how to interpret. "Okay, Mom. Saturday afternoon works for us. But if this is about money again, we've already explained that things are tight right now with—" "It's not about money, David. Not in the way you think." Saturday afternoon, I took the subway to Brooklyn, carrying a manila envelope filled with documents and a heart full of nervous determination. I'd dressed carefully for this meeting. Not my usual casual clothes, but the navy blue suit I'd worn to Harold's funeral. Something about wearing it made me feel stronger, more authoritative, more worthy of respect. Rebecca answered the door with her usual polite smile, but I could see the wariness in her eyes. She'd always been good at reading people, and she sensed that something had shifted in our dynamic. "Marjorie? Come in, come in." David's in the living room with the kids. Can I get you some tea? The same offer she'd made dozens of times before. But today, it felt different. Less like hospitality, and more like a strategy to maintain control of the situation. Tea would be lovely, thank you. I settled into the living room where David was helping Emma with homework, while Michael played with blocks on the floor. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so normal, that for a moment I almost lost my resolve. These were my grandchildren. This was my son. How could I risk destroying these relationships over money and hurt feelings? But then I remembered the voice recording, the casual cruelty, the calculated manipulation, the years of exploitation disguised as family obligation. Dad, I can't figure out this math problem, Emma complained, pushing her homework away in frustration. Let me see, sweetheart. David leaned over to examine her worksheet, and I watched his face take on the patient, loving expression he reserved for his children. The same expression he'd once shown me, back when I was still useful to him in ways that mattered. Kids, why don't you go play upstairs for a little while? Rebecca suggested as she brought in a tray with tea and cookies. Grandma Marjorie and your parents need to have a grown-up conversation. Grandma Marjorie. Not just grandma, as if she needed to specify which grandmother, despite being the only one present. Another small way of reminding everyone that I was an outsider in this family, a visiting relative rather than an integral part of their lives. Once the children had gone upstairs, David turned to me with an expression I recognized from his childhood, the look he'd worn when he knew he was in trouble, but wasn't sure exactly how much trouble yet. So, Mom, what did you want to talk about? Instead of answering immediately, I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope. I placed it on the coffee table between us, letting it sit there while I took a sip of my tea. I received some interesting documents in the mail recently, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Legal papers related to property ownership and loan guarantees. Papers with my signature on them. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Rebecca's polite smile faltered slightly, and David's expression shifted from mild curiosity to obvious discomfort. Mom, if this is about the business loan I asked you to co-sign, it's not about a business loan, David. Because there was no business loan, was there? I opened the envelope and pulled out the mortgage documents, spreading them across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. Which, in a way, they were. According to these papers, I guaranteed the mortgage on this house. This house that you told me was purchased entirely through Rebecca's family money. This house that I've been helping you afford for years while you complained about how tight money was. Rebecca's face had gone pale, but she quickly recovered her composure. Marjorie, I think there might be some confusion here. The paperwork can be complicated and sometimes... There's no confusion, Rebecca. I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I've spent the past week meeting with lawyers and accountants, making sure I understood exactly what these documents mean. I pulled out another set of papers. Bank statements showing the pattern of financial support I'd provided over the years. I've also been tracking my financial contributions to your household. $83,000 over the past 10 years, not including the mortgage guarantee, which puts me at risk for another $160,000 if you default. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at the papers as if they might disappear if he looked at them hard enough. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. Mom, we never meant for you to feel like... How I feel isn't really the issue here, David. The issue is what you've done, the deception, the manipulation, the complete disregard for my financial security. I pulled out the final document, a legal letter from my attorney demanding full disclosure of all financial arrangements involving my participation. My lawyer has advised me that what you've done constitutes financial elder abuse, that I have grounds for both civil and criminal action if I choose to pursue them. Rebecca's composure finally cracked. Now wait just a minute. Nobody forced you to give us money. You offered. You insisted, even when we said we could manage on our own. The lie was so blatant, so completely contrary to reality, that I actually laughed. Is that really the story you're going with, Rebecca? That I forced my financial support on you? That you reluctantly accepted my help out of politeness? I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the voice memo app I'd used to record our previous conversations from memory as soon as I'd gotten home from discovering their recording. Because I have some recordings of my own that tell a very different story. I didn't actually have recordings of them saying those cruel things. I'd deleted their voice memo without copying it. But they didn't need to know that. The fear in their eyes told me they remembered exactly what they'd said about me, and exactly how it would sound if played back to a lawyer or a judge. David leaned forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mom, this is getting out of hand. We're family. We don't need lawyers and legal threats to work out our problems." "You're right, David. We are family, or at least we used to be. But families don't lie to each other. They don't manipulate each other. They don't exploit each other financially while planning to discard each other as soon as it becomes convenient." I stood up, gathering the papers back into my envelope. "I'm not asking for an apology, because I don't think you're capable of genuine remorse. I'm not asking for the money back, because I know you don't have it. What I'm asking for is an end to this arrangement." Rebecca's voice was sharp with panic now. "What do you mean, an end to the arrangement?" "I mean no more financial support from me, no more loan co-signings, no more emergency funds or monthly contributions or help with the mortgage. You wanted to be independent of me so badly? Congratulations. Starting now, you are." David stood up too, his voice rising. "Mom, you can't just cut us off like this. We depend on your help. The kids depend on it. The kids depend on it because you've built a lifestyle that requires my financial contribution to maintain. That's not my problem anymore. That's yours." I walked toward the door, then turned back to face them. "If you want a relationship with me going forward, it will be based on genuine affection and respect, not on what I can provide financially. If you can't love me without my money, then you don't actually love me at all." Rebecca's mask finally slipped completely. "You know what, Marjorie? You're right. This family will be better off without you constantly hovering around, judging our choices and making everything about yourself. The kids barely tolerate you as it is." The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. But instead of crushing me, as it would have in the past, it felt liberating. She'd finally said out loud what I'd suspected for years. The pretense was over. The real nature of our relationship was revealed. "Thank you, Rebecca, for finally being honest about how you really feel. It makes what I'm about to do much easier." I walked to the front door, then paused with my hand on the knob. "David, you have 2 weeks to find alternative arrangements for the mortgage. My lawyer will be contacting the bank to remove me from the loan guarantee. I suggest you start looking into refinancing options." "Mom, wait. Please. Let's talk about this rationally." "Arst!" But I was already walking down their front steps, breathing in the crisp December air like a woman who'd been underwater for years and finally surfaced. The subway ride back to Queens felt different this time. Instead of the familiar weight of disappointment and hurt feelings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Pure, clean relief at finally speaking the truth and standing up for myself. I wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation would solve everything. I knew they'd call, probably within days, alternating between apologies and threats, trying to manipulate me back into my old role as their personal ATM. But for the first time in years, I felt prepared to handle whatever came next. That evening, I called Mrs. Torres and invited her over for dinner. We sat in my small kitchen eating takeout Chinese food and drinking wine, and I told her everything that had happened. "I'm proud of you, Marjorie," she said, raising her glass in a toast. "It takes courage to stand up to family, especially when you know it might cost you the relationship." "The relationship was already lost," I replied. I just finally admitted it to myself. We talked late into the night about family dynamics and financial boundaries, and the particular challenges faced by older women who'd been conditioned their whole lives to put everyone else's needs before their own. "You know what the worst part is?" I told her as we finished the bottle of wine. "It's not the money. It's realizing that the son I raised, the little boy I loved so completely, grew up to be someone who could treat me this way. That's the loss I'm really mourning." Mrs. Torres nodded knowingly. "Sometimes our children become people we wouldn't choose to have in our lives if they weren't related to us. That's a hard truth to accept, but it's still the truth." The next morning, I woke up early and made myself a proper breakfast for the first time in months. Scrambled eggs and toast and fresh orange juice, eaten slowly at my kitchen table while reading the newspaper. Simple pleasures I'd stopped allowing myself in my constant rush to be available for other people's needs. Around 10 o'clock, my phone started ringing. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it go to voicemail. Then Rebecca called. Voicemail. Then David again. Then a number I didn't recognize, which I assumed was one of their friends or relatives enlisted to help with their campaign to bring me back into line. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I got dressed and took the subway into Manhattan to meet with my lawyer again. We spent 2 hours reviewing my options and drafting the legal documents necessary to remove me from their mortgage guarantee. It would take some time and potentially some money, but it could be done. Are you prepared for the possibility that they might default on the loan once you're no longer responsible for it? She asked me. That's their choice to make, I replied. I can't control their financial decisions, but I can control my involvement in them. When I got home that afternoon, there were 17 missed calls on my phone and a text message from David that simply said, "Please call me back. We need to talk." I deleted the message without responding. That evening, Rebecca showed up at my door unannounced. I could see her through the peephole, pacing back and forth in the hallway like a caged animal. She knocked repeatedly, her voice sharp with frustration. "Marjorie, I know you're in there. Your lights are on, and Mrs. Torres said she saw you come home. We need to discuss this situation rationally." I sat quietly in my living room, sipping tea and reading a book, until she finally gave up and left. The next day brought a bouquet of flowers with a card from David. "Mom, I'm sorry if we hurt your feelings. Can we please talk this through like adults?" I threw the flowers away and kept the card as evidence of their manipulation tactics. This pattern continued for almost 2 weeks. Phone calls I didn't answer. Text messages I deleted without reading. Unannounced visits I ignored. Each attempt to reestablish contact felt more desperate and less sincere than the last. Finally, on a Thursday evening, David showed up at my door with both children in tow. Emma and Michael pressed their faces against my peephole, waving and calling my name sweetly. The emotional manipulation was obvious and cruel, using my love for my grandchildren as leverage to force me into a conversation I wasn't ready to have. But for the first time in years, I was strong enough to resist. I opened the door, but kept the chain lock engaged, so I could see them but they couldn't enter. "Hello, Emma. Hello, Michael. You both look wonderful. Grandma Marjorie!" Michael pressed his small face against the gap in the door. "Daddy says you're mad at us. Are you mad at us?" My heart broke a little, but my resolve remained firm. "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart. I love you both very much. But I need to talk to grown-ups about grown-up things before we can have our regular visits again." David stepped closer to the door, his voice pleading. "Mom, please, let us in. The kids miss you, and we need to work this out as a family." The family dynamic is exactly what we need to work out, David. And that's a conversation for adults, not something that should involve the children. I could see Rebecca waiting in their car at the curb, probably coaching David on what to say through text messages. "We can work together to fix this," David continued. "But not if you won't even talk to us." "I'm happy to talk, David, but only when you're ready to have an honest conversation about respect and boundaries. When you're ready to acknowledge what you've done and make genuine changes." "Mom, we never meant to." Until you can finish that sentence with the truth instead of another excuse, we don't have anything to discuss. I closed the door gently but firmly. Listening to Michael call my name through the wood, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but I knew it was necessary. They needed to understand that my love for my grandchildren wouldn't override my need for dignity and respect. The manipulation attempts continued for several more days, but with decreasing frequency and intensity. They were finally beginning to understand that I'd changed in some fundamental way, that the old tactics weren't going to work anymore. The breakthrough came in an unexpected form. 3 weeks after my confrontation with David and Rebecca, I received a phone call from Emma. Not from her parents' phone, but from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, her young voice was shaky with emotion. "Grandma Marjorie? It's Emma. I'm calling from my friend Sarah's house." "Hello, sweetheart. Is everything okay? I heard Mom and Dad talking about you. They said you're not going to be our grandma anymore because you're angry about money." My heart clenched, but I forced my voice to remain calm. "Emma, That's not exactly true. I will always be your grandmother, and I will always love you. But sometimes grown-ups need to work out their problems before they can spend time together. Did we do something wrong? Is that why you won't come over anymore? The pain in her voice was genuine, and I realized that she and Michael were just as much victims of their parents' behavior as I was. They were being used as pawns in an emotional manipulation game, denied a relationship with their grandmother because their parents couldn't accept reasonable boundaries. You didn't do anything wrong, Emma. You and Michael are wonderful children, and I'm very proud to be your grandmother. This is about problems between your parents and me, not about you. Can you fix it? The problems, I mean? I'm trying, sweetheart. But it takes time, and it requires everyone to be honest and willing to change. We talked for several more minutes, and I could hear the confusion and hurt in her voice. She was old enough to sense that something significant had shifted in our family dynamic, but too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships and financial boundaries. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling both heartbroken and resolved. Those children were innocent victims of their parents' selfishness and manipulation. They deserved better than being used as emotional weapons in a conflict they didn't understand. But protecting them from further manipulation meant maintaining my boundaries, even when it was painful. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in and took a personal day from work. Instead of my usual routine of rushing to meet everyone else's needs, I spent the day doing things that brought me joy. I went to the New York Public Library and spent hours reading in the beautiful Rosemain Reading Room. I had lunch at a small cafe in the village where I'd never eaten because it seemed too expensive for someone who was constantly giving money away. I walked through Central Park, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall and feeling the crisp air fill my lungs. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself instead of just existing for other people's convenience. That evening, I started a journal. Not just recording events, but processing my emotions and thoughts about this dramatic shift in my life. Writing helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't just anger or hurt feelings. It was grief. I was mourning the loss of the family relationships I'd thought I had, while simultaneously celebrating the discovery of my own strength and worth. Over the next few weeks, I established new routines that didn't revolve around other people's schedules and demands. I joined a book club at the community center. I started taking a watercolor painting class on Tuesday evenings. I volunteered at a local literacy program, helping adults learn to read. Each new activity was a small act of rebellion against the role I'd been trapped in for so long, the role of someone whose only value came from what she could provide to others. The legal process of removing myself from David and Rebecca's mortgage guarantee moved slowly but steadily forward. My lawyer kept me informed of each step, and I felt a sense of accomplishment with each document filed and each legal barrier overcome. I also started seeing a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and financial abuse. Our weekly sessions helped me understand how I'd gotten trapped in such a destructive pattern, and more importantly, how to avoid falling back into it. Generosity becomes enabling when it prevents other people from taking responsibility for their own lives, she explained during one of our sessions. You weren't helping your son by constantly rescuing him from financial consequences. You were preventing him from learning to manage his own affairs. The insight was both painful and liberating. I'd thought I was being a good mother by always being available to help. Instead, I'd been enabling my son's irresponsibility while sacrificing my own financial security and emotional well-being. Christmas was approaching. The 1-year anniversary of that devastating dinner where Rebecca had called me a fat pig and told me to stay out of their family matters. I dreaded the holiday season, knowing it would bring back all the painful memories of last year's humiliation, but it also represented an opportunity to create new memories, new traditions that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been. I decided to spend Christmas volunteering at a soup kitchen in Manhattan. If I was going to be alone for the holiday, I wanted to spend it helping people who had even less than I did. It seemed like a better use of my time than sitting in my apartment feeling sorry for myself. The volunteer coordinator at the soup kitchen was a woman about my age named Patricia, who'd been running holiday meal programs for over 20 years. We always need help on Christmas Day, she told me when I called to inquire. Most volunteers want to be with their families, so we're usually short-staffed. I don't have family plans this year, I told her. I'd like to spend the day doing something meaningful. Christmas morning, I woke up early and dressed carefully. Not in my funeral suit this time, but in comfortable clothes suitable for working in a kitchen. I took the subway into the city, feeling nervous but determined. The soup kitchen was bustling with activity by the time I arrived. Other volunteers were already preparing food, setting up serving lines and arranging tables. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, filled with people who'd chosen to spend their holiday helping others. I spent the morning helping prepare vegetables for the meal and setting up dining areas. The work was simple but satisfying, and I found myself chatting easily with the other volunteers. Many of them had their own stories of family difficulties, financial struggles, or personal losses that had led them to spend Christmas serving others. "I've been coming here for 5 years," one woman told me as we arranged place settings. "Ever since my husband died and my children moved across the country, it beats spending the day alone feeling sorry for myself." When the meal service began, I worked behind the serving line, ladling mashed potatoes onto plates and greeting each person who came through the line. The guests ranged from obviously homeless individuals to working families who were struggling financially. Each face told a story of hardship, but also of resilience and hope. One elderly man reminded me of Harold, the same gentle eyes, the same careful way of speaking. When I handed him his plate, he smiled and said, "Thank you kindly, miss. Merry Christmas." That simple exchange, that moment of human connection with someone who had nothing to give me except gratitude, felt more meaningful than all the expensive gifts I'd given my family over the years. During my lunch break, I called Emma from the soup kitchen's office phone. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I said when she answered. "Grandma Marjorie, Merry Christmas. Are you coming to our house today?" "Not today, Emma. I'm volunteering at a place that serves Christmas dinner to people who don't have families to celebrate with." "That sounds nice. Mom said you were probably alone today and feeling sad." Rebecca's attempt to paint me as a lonely, pathetic figure actually made me smile. "Actually, I'm having a wonderful day. I'm meeting new people and helping families who need it. It feels really good to do something meaningful for Christmas." We talked for several more minutes, and I could hear the wistfulness in Emma's voice. She was clearly having a fine Christmas with her parents and gifts and traditional festivities, but something about my different choice intrigued her. "Maybe next year I could volunteer with you," she suggested. "I'd like that very much, Emma. When you're a little older, we can definitely explore that possibility." After we hung up, I realized that this conversation felt different from all my previous interactions with my family. There was no desperation in my voice, no pleading for acceptance or approval. I was simply sharing what I was doing, without needing any particular response or validation. The afternoon flew by as we served hundreds of people and cleaned up from the meal service. By the time I was ready to leave, I felt tired but energized, empty but full at the same time. Patricia walked me to the subway station as the sun was setting over Manhattan. "Thank you for joining us today, Marjorie. You were a natural at this kind of work. I hope you'll consider volunteering with us regularly." "I think I will," I replied. Today felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. The subway ride back to Queens gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed in just 1 year. Last Christmas, I'd been devastated by my family's treatment of me, desperate for their acceptance, willing to endure any amount of disrespect just to maintain some connection with them. This Christmas, I'd spent the day serving others, connecting with new people, and creating meaning from my own choices rather than waiting for other people to give my life significance. The transformation was profound and undeniable. Over the next few months, I continued building a life that reflected my values and interests rather than just serving other people's needs. I kept volunteering at the soup kitchen. I took more art classes and joined a walking group that explored different neighborhoods throughout the city. I even started dating, something I hadn't done since Harold's death 8 years earlier. His name was Robert, and he was a retired teacher I met through the literacy program. He was kind and intelligent and had his own stories of difficult family relationships. We started having coffee after our volunteer shifts, then dinner, then longer conversations about books and travel and the challenges of aging gracefully. Nothing romantic developed between us. We were both at stages of life where companionship mattered more than passion. But his friendship became an important part of my new reality. He reminded me that I was still capable of forming meaningful relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. David and Rebecca made periodic attempts to reestablish contact, but their efforts became increasingly half-hearted as the months passed. They'd apparently found alternative financial arrangements, whether through family assistance, refinancing, or simply cutting expenses. I never learned and didn't particularly care. The important thing was that they were managing their affairs without my involvement, which had always been the goal. I did maintain contact with Emma and Michael, though under clearly defined circumstances. We met for lunch occasionally, usually at a restaurant near their school, and I kept our conversations focused on their interests and activities rather than family drama. They were growing up to be thoughtful, interesting children, and I enjoyed our time together even in this limited format. The breakthrough I'd been hoping for came in an unexpected way. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in May when Emma called me from her friend's house again. But this time her voice wasn't shaky with confusion. It was clear and determined. "Grandma Marjorie, I've been thinking about what you said at Christmas, about respect and boundaries. I think I understand now why you can't come to our house anymore." "Oh? What do you understand, sweetheart?" "I heard Mom talking to her friend about you. She said some really mean things that made me realize she doesn't treat you very nicely." My heart ached for my granddaughter, who was obviously processing some difficult realizations about her parents' behavior. "Emma, your parents love you very much. Sometimes grown-ups have problems with each other, but that doesn't change how much they love their children. I know they love me and Michael, but they should love you too. You're part of our family, and families are supposed to be nice to each other." The maturity in her voice astonished me. At 11 years old, she was demonstrating better emotional intelligence than her parents had shown in decades. "You're absolutely right, Emma. Families should be kind to each other. That's exactly what I've been trying to explain to your parents. Maybe I could talk to them. Tell them they should apologize to you and start treating you better." I smiled at her innocent belief that she could solve this problem through direct communication. "That's very sweet of you, sweetheart. But this is something your parents need to figure out for themselves. You shouldn't have to worry about grown-up problems." We talked for several more minutes, and by the end of our conversation, I felt hopeful in a way I hadn't expected. If Emma could understand the basic principles of respect and kindness at her age, maybe there was some chance for positive change in our family dynamic as she and Michael grew older. Even if their parents never changed, maybe the next generation would be different. That hope was tested sooner than I anticipated. 2 weeks after my conversation with Emma, David called me. Not Rebecca this time, not a manipulation attempt using the children, but David himself, speaking in a voice I barely recognized. "Mom, could we meet somewhere to talk? Just you and me without Rebecca or the kids. I think we need to have a real conversation." The request surprised me. In all the months since our confrontation, he'd never suggested meeting without Rebecca present to manage the conversation. "Where did you have in mind?" I asked. "Maybe that diner near your apartment, the one where we used to go when I was a kid?" The suggestion touched me despite my wariness. Mickey's Diner had been our special place when David was young, where I'd take him for pancakes on Saturday mornings when money was tight, but I wanted to give him a treat. "I remember that place. Saturday at 10? That works. And Mom? Thank you for agreeing to this. I know I probably don't deserve it." Saturday morning, I arrived at Mickey's a few minutes early and chose a booth in the back where we could have privacy. The diner looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. Faded red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, the smell of bacon grease and coffee hanging in the air. David arrived looking nervous and older than I remembered. The confidence he'd worn like armor during our previous confrontations was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Hi, Mom. Thank you for coming." He slid into the booth across from me, fidgeting with his coffee cup and avoiding eye contact. "You said you wanted to have a real conversation, David. I'm listening." He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "I need to apologize. Not just for the mortgage thing, or for not appreciating your financial help over the years, but for everything, for the way we've treated you, the way I've treated you." I waited, saying nothing. This apology felt different from his previous attempts. Less strategic, more genuine. Emma has been asking me a lot of questions lately. About why you don't come to our house anymore. About why family relationships are so complicated. I tried to explain it in a way that made us look reasonable, but he paused, staring into his coffee cup. But the more I tried to explain our side of things, the more I realized how terrible we've been to you. How terrible I've been. Go on. I think somewhere along the way I started seeing you as an obligation rather than as my mother. Like your love was something I was entitled to rather than something I should be grateful for. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. Rebecca made it worse, but I can't blame everything on her. I made my own choices. I said my own cruel things. I participated in treating you like a service provider instead of family. The silence stretched between us, filled with 20 years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. David, I appreciate you saying all of this, but apologies are just words unless they're followed by changed behavior. I know that, and I'm not asking you to trust me again right away, or to go back to the way things were before. I'm asking if there's any possibility of starting over, building something different, something better. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated emotion, but what I saw looked like genuine remorse and a dawning awareness of how much damage had been done. What about Rebecca? How does she feel about your desire to start over? David's expression darkened slightly. Rebecca and I are having our own problems. She's not happy about some of the changes I'm trying to make in how we handle family relationships. Changes such as setting boundaries around how we talk about you in front of the kids. Such as taking responsibility for our own financial obligations instead of constantly looking for bailouts. Such as treating you with the respect you deserve instead of taking your love for granted. These were significant changes, if they were real. But I'd been disappointed too many times to accept them at face value. David, I need you to understand something. I've built a life for myself over the past year that doesn't depend on your approval or inclusion. I'm not the desperate, lonely woman I was when this all started. I have friends, activities, purposes that have nothing to do with being your mother. He nodded sadly. I can see that. Emma tells me about your volunteer work and your art classes. She's really proud of you, actually. She brags to her friends about her grandmother who helps feed homeless people. The thought of Emma being proud of me brought tears to my eyes. What are you hoping for, David? What would starting over look like to you? I don't know exactly. Maybe we could meet like this sometimes. Have conversations that aren't about money or family drama. Get to know each other as adults instead of just falling back into old patterns. And the financial arrangements? The mortgage guarantee I'm still trying to get removed from? That's already handled. We refinanced last month. Your name isn't on any of our financial obligations anymore. This was news to me. My lawyer had mentioned that the removal process was proceeding, but I hadn't realized it was complete. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I wanted to prove that we could manage our own affairs before asking for any kind of relationship repair. I didn't want you to think this was just another manipulation to get you back into a financial support role. We talked for another hour, covering topics we hadn't discussed in years. His work, his concerns about the kids, his regrets about the choices he'd made in his marriage and his relationship with me. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much damage had been done for that to happen in a single conversation. But it felt like a beginning, a tentative first step toward building something healthier than what we'd had before. As we prepared to leave, David reached across the table and touched my hand gently. Mom, I know I have a lot to make up for. I know trust has to be earned back gradually, but I want you to know that I love you. I've always loved you, even when I was too selfish and stupid to show it properly. I love you too, David. I always have. That was never the question. We hugged in the parking lot of Mickey's Diner, and for the first time in years, it felt genuine. Not obligatory or manipulative, but real. The months that followed brought gradual but meaningful changes in our relationship. David and I met for coffee every few weeks, having conversations that felt more like friendship than the hierarchical parent-child dynamic that had dominated our previous interactions. He started bringing the children to visit me in Queens occasionally, Short afternoon visits where we could spend time together without the tension and drama that had characterized family gatherings at their house. Rebecca remained distant and somewhat hostile, but David no longer seemed to require her approval for maintaining a relationship with me. This created some tension in their marriage, but that was their issue to resolve, not mine. The most meaningful change was in my relationship with Emma and Michael. Free from the complex family politics that had previously surrounded our interactions, I could simply be their grandmother. We went to movies together, visited museums, explored different neighborhoods in the city. Emma, especially, seemed to appreciate having a grandmother who treated her like an individual rather than just an extension of her parents. She started calling me regularly, sharing details about school and friends and her own developing opinions about family relationships. "I'm glad you stood up for yourself, Grandma Marjorie," she told me during one of our phone calls. "Mom always taught me that it's important to respect yourself, but I didn't understand what that meant until I watched you do it." Those words meant more to me than any apology or financial restitution ever could. As I write this, it's been 2 years since that terrible Christmas dinner when Rebecca called me a fat pig, and I finally reached my breaking point. 2 years since I slid that envelope across their table and changed everything. I'm sitting in my queen's apartment, but it looks nothing like the sad, cramped space it was before. I've redecorated with bright colors and comfortable furniture that reflects my taste, rather than just making do with what I could afford after giving most of my money away. The walls are covered with my watercolor paintings, landscapes, and still lifes that capture the beauty I've learned to see in everyday moments. I'm not a great artist, but I'm an enthusiastic one, and the act of creating something beautiful brings me joy in ways I'd forgotten were possible. My social calendar is full but not overwhelming. Book club on Mondays, volunteer work at the soup kitchen twice a week, art class on Tuesdays, coffee with Robert on Fridays, weekend visits with Emma and Michael when they're available, dinner with Mrs. Torres and her family when they invite me. It's a life built around my own interests and values rather than other people's expectations and demands. The financial stress that dominated my existence for so many years is gone. Without the constant drain of supporting David and Rebecca's lifestyle, my modest savings account is actually growing. I've been able to afford some small luxuries: good coffee, fresh flowers, the occasional dinner at a nice restaurant, without feeling guilty or calculating the cost in terms of what I won't be able to provide for others. I sleep peacefully now, without the anxiety that used to wake me in the middle of the night wondering how I'd manage the next financial emergency or emotional crisis in my family. Most importantly, I've learned to value myself in ways that don't depend on other people's approval or gratitude. I spent so many years believing that my worth came from what I could give to others that I'd forgotten I had any intrinsic value at all. The process of reclaiming my dignity wasn't easy. There were moments of profound loneliness, times when I questioned whether standing up for myself was worth the potential cost of losing my family relationships entirely. But I learned that relationships based on exploitation and disrespect aren't really relationships at all. They're just elaborate systems of mutual manipulation disguised as love. Real love, the kind I have now with Emma and Michael, the friendship I've built with Robert and Mrs. Torres, the respect my volunteer colleagues show me, doesn't require me to sacrifice my financial security or emotional well-being to maintain it. The Christmas after my confrontation with David and Rebecca, I hosted a small holiday dinner in my apartment. Emma and Michael were there, along with Robert and Mrs. Torres and a few friends from my volunteer work. We crowded around my small kitchen table, eating a meal I'd prepared with joy rather than obligation. There were no expensive gifts, no elaborate decorations, no attempts to impress anyone with displays of wealth or generosity, just good food, genuine conversation, and the warm feeling of being surrounded by people who valued my presence rather than just what I could provide. Emma helped me serve dessert, a simple apple pie I'd made from my grandmother's recipe, and as I watched her carefully carry plates to our guests, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the changes that had brought us to this moment. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not the complicated dance of manipulation and resentment that had characterized my relationship with David and Rebecca, but simple, straightforward affection between people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being. As our guests were preparing to leave that evening, Emma pulled me aside. "This was the best Christmas dinner ever, Grandma Marjorie. Everyone here really likes you, not because you do things for them, but because you're you." That observation from my 11-year-old granddaughter perfectly captured what I'd been trying to achieve through all the painful months of setting boundaries and demanding respect. I wanted to be valued for who I was, not what I could provide. The irony is that once I stopped trying to buy love and approval, I found genuine versions of both. The people in my life now care about me because they enjoy my company, appreciate my perspectives, and find meaning in our shared experiences. I'm no longer the desperate, lonely woman who would accept any treatment just to avoid abandonment. I'm not the anxious people-pleaser who measured her worth by how much she could sacrifice for others. I'm Marjorie Thompson, 75 years old, a woman who has learned to love herself enough to insist on being treated with dignity and respect. If you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own experience, if you found yourself giving and giving until there's nothing left, if you've been treated like an ATM by people who claim to love you, if you've accepted disrespect because you're afraid of being alone, I want you to know something. You are worth more than what you can provide to others. Your value as a human being isn't determined by your usefulness or your willingness to sacrifice yourself for other people's convenience. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. Demanding respect isn't unreasonable. Protecting your financial security isn't greedy. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. And sometimes walking away from those relationships, even temporarily, is the only way to save ourselves and possibly save the relationships too. The hardest lesson I learned was that some people will only value what they think they might lose. As long as I was always available, always giving, always accepting whatever treatment they offered, there was no reason for David and Rebecca to consider changing their behavior. Only when I was willing to walk away completely did they begin to understand how much damage they'd caused. Not every story like mine has a happy ending. Some families never learn to treat each other with respect. Some relationships are too damaged to repair. Some people are too selfish or too damaged themselves to recognize the hurt they cause others. But even when reconciliation isn't possible, there's still value in standing up for yourself. There's still dignity in refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth as a human being. I'm grateful that David was eventually able to recognize his mistakes and make genuine efforts to change. I'm grateful that Emma and Michael have a grandmother who can model self-respect and healthy boundaries for them. I'm grateful for the meaningful relationships I've built with people who value me for who I am, rather than what I can give them. But even if none of that had happened, even if standing up for myself had cost me those relationships entirely, it still would have been the right choice, because living with dignity, even alone, is better than living without it, even surrounded by family. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family members or loved ones treated you like an ATM rather than a person? Have you struggled with setting boundaries because you were afraid of losing relationships that weren't actually healthy to begin with? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes just sharing our experiences helps us realize we're not alone in struggling with these difficult dynamics. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these personal stories, and maybe together we can help others find the courage to demand the respect and love they deserve. Because from the deepest wounds, the strongest souls emerge. And you, my friend, are stronger than you know.